Greetings. Welcome. I'm not here today, but I'm kind of here today because I'm on video. And we're going to do a couple of things in this video. First, we're going to watch a review video on respiration because we're going to have an open note quiz tomorrow on it. And I think it's been about 5 days since we talked about it. So this video does a good job of going through the 3 phases of respiration. And they talk a little bit more complicated than we do. But if you take out the picture that we drew of respiration and kind of follow along from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, I think it will really help us review. From there, we're going to move on and take some notes on something called anaerobic respiration.
How do you turn that bite of food into a chemical that a cell can recognize and use as energy? The first step is altering the food into its component chemical compounds and then getting those molecules into your cells. That process is called digestion. Once inside your cells, the process of turning that bite of food into useful energy by cellular respiration begins. The process of digestion results with carbohydrates and other molecules being removed from the consumed food and transported into the bloodstream. From there, nutrients, like the carbohydrate glucose, will leave the bloodstream through a capillary wall and enter a tissue cell. Once inside the cell, cellular respiration will completely oxidize the glucose molecule, releasing high-energy electrons. The overall goal is to make ATP, a storage form of energy for most cells. Cellular respiration is a 4-stage process that begins with glycolysis. Glycolysis literally means splitting sugars, and it is the first step of cellular respiration, occurring in the cytoplasm of the cell. Glycolysis consists of 2 distinct phases, an energy investment phase and an energy harvesting phase. In the energy investment phase, 2 ATP molecules transfer energy to the glucose molecule, forming a 6-carbon sugar diphosphate molecule. This molecule splits, and the energy harvesting phase begins. During this phase, the 2 3-carbon molecules are converted to pyruvate, and ATP is formed. Glycolysis is a 10-step reaction that involves the activity of multiple enzymes and enzyme assistance. In the process, a net of 2 molecules of ATP, 2 molecules of pyruvate, and 2 high-energy electron-carrying molecules of NADH are produced. When oxygen is present, the pyruvate molecules and NADH enter the mitochondria, and the next stage of cellular respiration begins. The next stage of cellular respiration involves the movement of pyruvate into the mitochondria, where it undergoes oxidation. Each pyruvate molecule is converted into a compound called acetyl-CoA. In the process of pyruvate oxidation, electrons are transferred to NAD, producing NADH, and a carbon is lost, forming carbon dioxide. The next stage is the citric acid cycle, also called the Krebs cycle. Here, acetyl-CoA will bind with a starting compound called oxaloacetate, and through a series of enzymatic redox reactions, all carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens in pyruvate ultimately end up as carbon dioxide and water. The pathway is called a cycle because oxaloacetate is the starting and ending compound of the pathway. For every glucose that enters glycolysis, the cycle completes twice, once for each molecule of pyruvate that entered the mitochondria. During pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle, a net of 8 NADH, 2 FADH2, 2 ATP, and 6 CO2 are produced for each glucose molecule. In order to understand how the majority of the energy is produced by aerobic respiration, we need to follow the NADH and FADH2 molecules to the next stage, the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is a series of membrane-bound carriers in the mitochondria that pass electrons from one to another. As the electrons are transferred between the membrane proteins, the cell is able to capture energy and use it to produce ATP molecules. Proteins in the chain pump hydrogen ions across a membrane. When the hydrogen ions flow back across the membrane through an ATP synthase complex, ATP is synthesized by the enzyme ATP synthase. Oxygen acts as the terminal electron acceptor. By accepting electrons, oxygen is reduced to form water, a byproduct of the electron transport chain. All the high-energy electron carriers from the previous stages of cellular respiration bring their electrons into the chain. From this, the bulk of ATP from the entirety of cellular respiration is produced, a net of 32 to 36 ATP. In summary, we have seen how the 4 stages of cellular respiration are responsible for converting the energy found in the glucose molecule into ATP, the energy battery of the cell. On average, 36 ATP molecules are produced per glucose molecule that entered the cell. In the process of producing ATP, oxygen is brought in from the bloodstream to be the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain, and the carbon dioxide that is produced as a byproduct is released.
Hi, I'm back. I zoomed in a little. Too much? Too much? Too much? So anyways, now we're going to take notes on something called anaerobic respiration.
You're not going to amount to jack squat!
See, if you run out of oxygen, most of your cells will die. Your brain cells will die, your heart muscle cells will die. So that's why we try not to run out of oxygen. But there are a couple of cells that have managed to figure out how to make a little bit of ATP even if they don't have oxygen. Okay? And one of those cells is a cell that belongs in our body. Now, they can't make a ton of ATP. Instead of like 36 to 38, if you have oxygen, these will make more like 2. But if you do the math, 2 is 2 more than 0. So that's still something.
I'm going to shoot you with a BB gun when you're not looking. In the back of the head.
When glucose breaks during glycolysis, we make something called pyruvate. Now, if you just keep doing that, the pyruvate builds up and kills the cell. So when you can do something with that pyruvate, that's called fermentation. And there's 2 cells we're interested in that can ferment.
I sometimes have a feeling I can do crystal meth, but then I think, better not.
Alcoholic fermentation is done by a fungus cell called yeast. All right, and what they do with pyruvate, after they take glucose and split it into pyruvate, they turn it into 2 things, ethanol and carbon dioxide. Ethanol is the alcohol, the type of alcohol that you find in wine and beer and things like that. So when people make wine and beer and all that stuff, they used yeast cells to make ethanol. The carbon dioxide that's produced is also used, and when you put yeast into something like bread dough and then turn up the heat, the yeast eat the bread, and then they release carbon dioxide when they run out of oxygen inside the bread dough, and that's what makes the bread rise, and then they die. So really, when you eat bread, you're eating lots of dead spaces where a yeast cell died. It's really kind of sad and disturbing. Adam, put your phone away. Thank you. Now,
do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? Don't nobody understand the words that are coming out of your mouth, man.
this is a real important process for a couple of things. As we said, baking, they use yeast all the time. When you want something to rise, you have to put yeast in there. And they'll eat some of it, and then they'll run out of oxygen inside of whatever you put them in, your dough, and then they'll die. But before they die, they'll go to anaerobic respiration, and they'll release alcohol and carbon dioxide. Now, we don't have alcohol in our bread because it evaporates when it's cooking. I guess if you wanted to try to get a little buzz, you could eat like 40 flaming hot loaves of rising bread. But you're also going to get like third-degree mouth burns, and you're going to probably gain about 100 pounds. So it's a bad idea. This is bread rising. It's fascinating. then they reverse the motion so it shrinks, but it doesn't actually shrink. There's yeast in there. Kind of looks like a beating heart. Weird. Okay, our cells, our muscle cells, when we run so fast we run out of oxygen, they can also make ATP through anaerobic respiration, but it's called lactic acid. They take the pyruvate and they turn it into lactic acid.
Just doing my workout. Tuesday's arms and back.
Well, you asked me to come by, sir.
Oh, did I? Oh, it's a deep burn. Oh, it's so deep. Oh, I could barely lift my right arm because I did so many. I don't know if you heard me counting. I did over 1,000. You have your ubulus muscle that connects to the upper dorsimus. It's boring, but it's part of my life. I'm just going to grab this shirt if you don't mind. Just watch out for the guns. They'll get you.
So lactic acid builds up in our muscles when we push them too hard and they run out of oxygen. And that's what makes us sore. If you do a whole bunch of push-ups, you'll build up some lactic acid in your pecs. And then the next day when you touch it, ow, it'll really hurt. After a couple of days, it will leak out of the muscle, and then the liver will change it back into pyruvate. So it doesn't last forever, our sore muscles. But that protects us from pushing them too hard without oxygen. So here are the two, this picture just kind of shows you the two different types of fermentation. The one on the left is what our muscles do, that's lactic acid fermentation. So they take glucose, turn it into pyruvate, and then turn it into lactate, or lactic acid. A yeast cell will take glucose, turn it into pyruvate, make 2 ATP, and then turn it into ethanol and carbon dioxide. A couple of videos about it now.
The same lactic acid that makes yogurt tangy is the same lactic acid that builds up in our muscles when we exercise strenuously. Instead of bacteria fermenting the sugar and milk to make energy for themselves, our muscles ferment sugar in our diet to produce energy to contract. If, like when we're sprinting, lactic acid builds up in our muscles faster than it can be removed, we can end up with a burning sensation in our muscles, forcing us to stop. Now, if we train, we can increase the number of blood vessels in our muscles and clear out the lactate faster.
All right. So that's kind of what happens when you do your muscle. You can train it. You can make it so they can get rid of lactic acid and they can get more sugar and oxygen and not have to go to that level so soon. All right, this one is another one that kind of shows how our muscles get tired over time as they run out of oxygen and glucose, and then they can eventually fail.
Now let's measure bicep muscle fatigue during an isometric contraction task where you hold your arm at a 90-degree angle with your back against the wall to maintain posture. Note that you do not want to hold the dumbbell in your hand, as your wrist muscles will fatigue faster than your bicep. Instead, devise a way to hang weights directly off your forearm. Put the electrodes on your bicep as you've done before, and start the recording. Though not as obvious as the hand grip tasks, you will still notice a decrease in the EMG signal over time as your bicep becomes fatigued. The physiology of muscle fatigue is still very much an active research topic, and these experiments are only the beginning just to get you started.
Now deep thoughts. I'll never forget the time that skunk got under the porch and Grandpa went under to get him. Boy, it smelled for months. You know, that was the last time we ever saw Grandpa.
I hate goodbyes.
So when we eat food, we don't usually see a label for how much ATP it's going to give us. We usually see something called a calorie. That's a different way to measure energy. Because if your food was measured in ATPs, it had to be like in the trillions and quadrillions. So we use something smaller, or something larger, like a calorie, so we see it in smaller numbers. But just kind of to make sense out of all this, if you eat a whole bunch of calories worth of food, but don't use as much ATP as that food gives you, then you have extra sugar. You have extra ATP, and your body will recognize that, and it will start to store it as fat over time. If you do the opposite and you use more ATP every day, and then your body needs more glucose, it will take the fat, convert it to glucose, and then your body fat levels will go down. So there's kind of a balance between how much energy you use every day and how much energy you eat every day. Quiz tomorrow on respiration. You can use your notes.